Pleasure to be here with you in this session, especially to discuss the work of one of the most important and formidable historians of our time, and certainly of her generation in Israel, and one with whom I had the distinct pleasure of studying in 1982. Over the course of 40 years, Anita, and one can only refer to Anita Shapira,
It's okay.
only as Anita.
There's only one Anita.
There's only one Anita. Anita has been at the forefront of historical studies of Zionism and the State of Israel from the time of her PhD dissertation on Avodah Ivrit in 1974. This book represents the culmination of 4 decades of research on the history of Zionism in the State of Israel, and it is a major achievement, bearing a number of the qualities that really characterize Anita's scholarship. It is therefore comprehensive in scope, reflecting a range of knowledge that is really unparalleled amongst her peers. It reveals a richly textured grasp of detail that lends the book an authoritative quality. And it is a masterful work of synthesis written in Anita's characteristically fluid literary style, such that reading a 500-page book like this is actually pleasurable, even though it deals with very difficult themes at many points. I'd like to reiterate Aviva's thanks to Brandeis University Press, to Ilan and Sylvia for their support of this really important piece of work and for bringing it to fruition. Now, when I think of this book in historiographical terms, this is sort of my unique cast, perhaps perverse cast of mind. I tend to think of it in comparison to a work published some 45 years ago, just as Anita was beginning her doctoral research. And I'm thinking of the so-called Sefer Adom of Shmuel Ettinger, volume 3 of the Toldot Am Yisrael. Ettinger's account reflected the state of historical scholarship in Israel in his time. His book was widely disseminated and became canonical. It also reflected an historical worldview anchored by Zionism as the animating force of Jewish history in the 20th century. Now, to be sure, there are differences between Ettinger and Anita. He was born in Kiev, she was born in Warsaw. He became a communist, she became a leading student and admirer of labor Zionism. Perhaps most important of all, he was based in Jerusalem and she in Tel Aviv. His book was published originally in Hebrew, hers initially in English. His Sefer Adom was partly about Zionism and the State of Israel. Hers is devoted entirely to those subjects. And yet, notwithstanding those differences, both were amongst the best-known Israeli historians of their time. Indeed, to a great extent, both represented the center of the Israeli historiographical establishment. Both were Zionist historians, deeply committed to the cause of Zionism, and both produced Zionist histories. And that's one of the first comments that I'd like to make about this book, Israel. It is a Zionist history of Israel. Now, that may seem self-evident, obvious to some, but I don't think necessarily so, as I hope to demonstrate a little bit later. The book opens with Herzl, and the last chapter concludes with him. At the center of the book is the quest by Jews to secure a foothold, a majority, and eventually a state in Palestine, followed by a detailed discussion of the State of Israel's political and military history. Indeed, to a great extent, this is a political history, a story of a political ideology transplanted from its laboratory to its testing ground, where it assumed concrete institutional form. In tracing this process, Anita notes a key transformation over time in the underlying political theory of the inhabitants of this land. That is to say, a shift from a more communitarian or republican sensibility, as she calls it, to a more liberal individualist ethos. And she regards this, if I read you correctly, with a trace of sadness and nostalgia, as reflecting the decline of the egalitarian spirit and sense of communal belonging that once obtained in pre-state Yishuv Palestine. In that sense, it reminds one, using Hayden White's famous scheme of emplotments, of a framing that is largely romantic, tinged by an element of tragedy. Now, in general, it has to be noted that Anita evinces deep identification with the Zionist project and the state. She declares at the end of the book, the great Zionist adventure was and is one of the most astonishing attempts ever made at building a nation.